Good morning, everyone. There's so much love in this room. Thank you so much for being here. As some of you know, 5 years ago, while hiking, I fell 30 feet and shattered my legs. My doctors said the trauma to my body and nervous system was similar to a serious car crash. I've experienced healing on so many levels, and many of you have been a part of that. Thank you. But what most people don't know is that since that fall, my past trauma occasionally intrudes on my present life. Sometimes when I'm riding in a car that someone else is driving, as the car reaches the speed of around 60 miles an hour, my heart races, my chest tightens, my breath shortens, and my body involuntarily braces for impact. Sometimes I involuntarily place my hands on the dashboard and say, "Watch out!" even though there is no real danger of hitting the car in front of us. Now, as you can imagine, this is very embarrassing for me and very disconcerting for the driver. When my husband, Bernie, is driving and I yell, "Watch out!" he instinctively slams on the brakes, creating real danger. We joke that my past trauma is taking years off his life. This experience of bracing for impact doesn't happen to me much anymore, but I admit occasionally it still does. So I'm wondering if anyone here would want to give me a ride home from the breakfast. Raise your hands. Ah, brave souls. Almost every conversation I find myself in these days, someone expresses feeling anxious and overwhelmed. It's as if they are living, bracing for impact. Some are anxious and overwhelmed by too much to do, by health challenges, by financial difficulties, or broken relationships. Some are anxious and overwhelmed by mass shootings, global warming, and the number of individuals suffering on the streets of Seattle. It's natural to feel anxious and overwhelmed occasionally, but none of us wants to live braced for impact. Psychologist and author Viktor Frankl, who survived a Nazi concentration camp, reminds us in Man's Search for Meaning that we have the power to choose how we will respond in each moment, out of love or out of fear. For whatever our circumstances, we were all created to be instruments of unconditional, higher love in the lives that are touched by ours. As some of you know, I've been talking a lot lately about 3 tips that could help us live from love instead of fear. The 3 tips are: turn inward, turn toward, and turn outward. I'd like to say a few words about those 3 tips. Tip number 1, turn inward. We humans, under stress, have a tendency toward aggression or avoidance. So we all need a practice of turning inward to that vast reservoir of love at the core of our being. That practice might be prayer, meditation, being in nature, or simply being fully present to the person right in front of us. Unless our doing in the world flows from being connected to and grounded in love, it will have limited power to heal or transform. You can't pour milk from an empty carton. That's why the entire Recovery Cafe community begins our day together with 5 minutes of silence. Tip number 2, for living from love instead of fear, turn toward. In a recent poll, 50% of adults in the US reported being lonely. Studies indicate that loneliness is as bad for our health as obesity. Therefore, we must turn toward others, forming and prioritizing authentic relationships. At Recovery Cafe, we define authentic relationships as those relationships where we are both deeply known and loved, both vulnerable and safe. Over time, being both known and loved, both vulnerable and safe, transforms us. At Recovery Cafe, we call the structures that hold this process of transformation recovery circles. In my recovery circle just 3 weeks ago, Jenna shared the immense grief of losing her only son. Carol responded immediately, "Jenna, your suffering is my suffering." Bottom line, everyone needs a recovery circle. Which brings me to tip number 3, for living from love instead of fear. Turn outward. One early morning a few weeks ago, Vicki, Allen, and I were walking around Green Lake. A young man who appeared to be homeless, who we didn't know and he didn't know us, cried out to us from the side of the walking path. He pleaded, "I need help for my mental illness." And he went on to explain, "Without help, no one will want to sit beside me on the bus. No one will want me in this community at all." According to the National Alliance on Mental Illness, out of the 46 million adults in the US suffering from a mental illness this past year, only 41% received the help they needed. And out of the 21.2 million individuals in the US suffering from substance use disorder this past year, only 17% received the help they needed. In the wealthiest, most innovative country in the world, how is that possible? How is that acceptable? If we are to live from love instead of fear, we must turn outward and create systems that care for all who are suffering and sick, for all who are currently left out. Unjust systems not only keep members of our human family ill and isolated, unjust systems literally steal years of life from our brothers and sisters. The life expectancy in Southeast King County is 18 years lower than in more affluent parts of King County. We cannot change the world simply by doing what can be done within unjust systems. We must turn outward and change unjust systems that create all kinds of inequality, even we must change those unjust systems even when we are beneficiaries of those unjust systems. In short, when we live as if we are not connected to parts of our human family, we inevitably live disconnected from parts of ourselves. For the illusion that we are separate from one another is the costliest, deadliest illusion of all time. In January, we will open our second Seattle Recovery Cafe in the Soto neighborhood. Thanks to many of you, last week, we completed the capital campaign to fund the renovation and some of the operating costs of that second cafe. There are now 20 recovery cafes in 11 states and the District of Columbia. And in 2020, a recovery cafe will open in Vancouver, BC. In all of these recovery cafe communities, individuals who once felt abandoned now have a long-term, supportive community in which to heal, belong, and become. In all of these recovery cafe communities, individuals are coming to know the wonder of their true worth, and that they have gifts to share with the whole community. In the midst of growing inequality in this country, Recovery Cafe is standing in the gap between those who have what they need to fulfill their potential and those who do not. Thank you, thank you, thank you for standing in that gap with us.